This is Arab Talk on KPOO 89.5 FM in San Francisco. This is Arab Talk with Jess and Jamal. I'm Jess Hannam.
And I'm Jamal Dajani.
Jamal, we're facing the catastrophe of war and occupation in Ukraine, Russia's murderous rampage against Ukrainian men, women, and children, as well as their ragtag team of military, continue unabated. It's getting worse as we speak now. Hundreds of civilians have been killed. Lviv and Kherson and Kharkiv are in the throes of a brutal attack as we speak. And Odessa is kind of on the precipice right now of an attack. The Russian war and occupation of Ukraine has caused kind of ripple effects throughout the world. As we know, the United States, NATO, and allies are attempting to institute economic sanctions against Russia and Putin and the oligarchs. We're going to be talking about that, as well as some political consequences of that. It's making some very strange bedfellows, but I hate to say this, Jamal, but my predictions, unfortunately, are proven correct. Putin has no intention of stopping, and if anybody wants any kind of perspective on what's going to happen in Ukraine, look to what happened in Chechnya. He brutally massacred and used vicious firepower on innocent civilians, men, women, and children. He's doing it now in Ukraine. This is not going to stop. This is going to be a bloodbath.
Well, we'll talk more about his new demands. As you know, the two previous attempts to negotiate an end to the conflict, just now we're on the 12th day,
Right.
proved fruitless. So there was the third meeting, which we'll talk about it, and then Putin basically delivered his demands to end hostilities. But first, we're gonna talk to our guest, Dr. Hatem Bazian, who is the executive director for the Islamophobia Studies Center and also a professor at Zaytuna College and lecturer at UC Berkeley. And he has written a very interesting article called Ukraine and Fanon, Racism is Atmospheric in Western Narrative, basically. So let's listen to Dr. Bazian. Europe's history is a long book filled with violence and very bloody. Europe had 2 world wars in the last century alone. The second one had Germany using ovens in Europe to burn people in the Holocaust, and 2 nuclear bombs dropped on Japan for a never experienced single moment of civilian mass killing. This is an excerpt from the article Ukraine and Fanon, Racism is Atmospheric in Western Discourse, written by Dr. Hatem Bazian, Executive Director of the Islamophobia Studies Center. Dr. Bazian is also professor at Zaytuna College and a lecturer in Middle Eastern languages and cultures and Asian American studies at UC Berkeley. Welcome again to Arab Talk, Dr. Bazian.
Oh, thank you. And it's good to see you, Jamal. It's been some time.
Yes, I mean, now we have to do everything, remotely. Your recent article exploring the colonial mindset that devalues non-white victims of war and other disasters starts with referencing Franz Fanon, and I want to just kind of shed some light on who's Franz Fanon, a French-educated psychiatrist from Martinique, who, while growing up in Martinique, witnessed and experienced abuse and degradation by French military who inhabited the island during World War II. He describes the colonial mindset as an all-encompassing white supremacist entitlement that justifies exploitation of non-whites due to a fundamental self-perceived superiority. Fanon is considered one of the definitive commentators on colonialism. Dr. Bazian, tell us why he is important.
Well, Franz Fanon is possibly one of the most significant critics of colonization, as well as foretelling the post-colonial world. His book, The Wretched of the Earth, is still possibly one of the most significant pieces of literature to look and critique colonization. Now, Fanon is also unique that he was actually sent to Algeria to work as a clinical psychiatrist under the French colonial regime to deal with those who face torture in Algeria, Muslims in Algeria. But he immediately began to actually see also the predicament of those who face torture, but also the torturers. He ended up actually joining the Algerian liberation movement and was one of its key contributors, serving as the spokesperson for the Algerian movement. So there are two individuals in the Algerian movement from outside that in terms of contribution. Franz Fanon is one, and then Iqbal Ahmed from Pakistan.
Right.
Both are major contribution in that field. Now, Fanon also has a number of books in addition to Wretched of the Earth, Black Skin, White Masks. This looks at the whole phenomena or internalization of racism and the double consciousness. He also had a book, The Dying Colonialism, and Toward the African Revolution. So if you take his work collectively, really he is one of those profound thinkers in the 50s to the 60s. He died young from cancer, but his material is still the subject of writing, research, and so on. The piece that I wanted to link Fanon to is this. He writes in his Wretched of the Earth on violence. He says that violence in the colonial structure is atmospheric. And this is also to make a distinction because when we think of violence, and this would be also operable to Palestine, you get somebody that's jumped on and says, well, it's peaceful today, right? Meaning there is no response from the colonized. But the colonized experience of violence is atmospheric. It is total. It actually confines their, just the air they breathe is filled with violence. And as such, violence as atmospheric, we borrowed and stretched the concept of Fanon to speak about how racism is atmospheric, is inescapable. It touches everything, it's everywhere. It is the air, the space, the sight that you experience. And I wanted to make this direct connection because as the Russia's attack on the Ukraine developed, many of these Western reporters and journalists began to speak in civilizational terms, speaking about that this is not a place like Iraq, Syria, and so on, where violence is experienced.
This was actually my second question. Yes. Really is to talk about the connection of atmospheric in its pervasiveness. You quote in that it colors the entire societal construct, and that's exactly like, how do you see that playing with the reaction to the invasion of Ukraine in the news coverage?
Well, it's precisely the notion. One is speaking of that this is not Iraq, Syria, and so on. This is not a place that is used to violence. And this is very important because Fanon's work, as well as others, there is a distinction between the civilized world and the world of the savage and the barbarian, the world of the Northern Hemisphere, Europe, United States, Canada, versus the places where, in essence, are the places where violence is seen as the norm, as almost pathological. But this view of civilized savage, civilized barbarian, you could see it in the work of Edward Said, Orientalism, and so on. It makes the distinction the distinction is possible if you have a complete erasure. It's almost amnesia, where you forget the realities of Europe. And that's the quote that you started the show with, in the sense of saying that Europe's history is bloody history. In essence, if you think about period, the long period of history, is one chapter after another of violence, of bloodthirst, of complete destruction, so much so that we did not have a regular war. They had to actually have world wars. They had to have a complete destruction, so that amnesia in there. So the description in terms of the geography, that this is not a geography of violence, the geography is violence belongs to the darker people. It will also identifying the refugees. All the refugees have to be treated correctly and appropriately. All refugees have to provide the service. All refugees have to be given the comfort fleeing from war. But the descriptions of the refugees began to focus on their physical characteristics, their blonde hair, blue eyes, like us. This is at a time where Europe has become fortress Europe. It's built, as we speak about the Ukrainian refugees correctly to attend to them, there are massive numbers of darker skinned refugees from the global south, from North Africa, from Sudan, Ethiopia, Senegal, Congo, from Afghanistan, Syria, that are locked up in literally prisons and detention centers in Italy, in Greece, in Spain, in France itself. You have all these refugees that are not given any actual papers or a way to formalize themselves. So the distinction becomes on the physical characteristics, which is a white supremacist view of looking at the Ukraine and seeing it as part of us versus the other who could be dispensed with, and using civilizational language to describe them. In the example of the Polish and Spanish parliament, the discussions about that we don't want to admit Muslims, that not a single Muslim.
Let me use this quote actually just to remind our listeners and viewers you're mentioning, and this is from the Spanish politician in the parliament, and while others, by the way, they were clapping, and this is what he said: "These are real refugees. Women, children, and elderly should be welcomed in Europe. Now everyone should understand the difference between these refugees and the invasion of Muslim youth of military age who have crossed our borders trying to destabilize and colonize Europe."
Yeah, well, again, that's precisely the point that makes a distinction between what is good immigrant, good refugee, and in one quote that these are high quality immigration versus the low grade immigration or the threat immigration or the immigration or refugees that are intent on replacement theory. So this actually fits into this whole Islamophobic, anti-Muslim, but also deeply held white supremacist racism that you are seeing articulated, whether it's in the Spanish, in the French, or in the Polish political leadership that is, in essence, refusing to normalize Muslims, Arabs, Africans' access into refugee status, while in this actually almost opening its borders. We got also reports of Arab and foreign African students who are caught on the border in Poland, not being allowed entry, not being allowed to actually move through with other refugees. In some images that came where they're actually being thrown out of their trains, the trains that are moving to try to take some of the refugees across Europe. So in the moment of the crisis where a human-centric approach should be taken, what we have is racism, white supremacy. This racism being atmospheric actually comes out and becomes the norm. Now, in here, I wanted to point that many of these reporters are being sensitive, or the person from NBC is saying, I want to choose my word carefully.
Right.
Now, if he was, what's his name? Degara, I think is his name. He wants to choose his words carefully. I wonder if you're choosing his word carefully, and this is what he comes, we wonder about what would be after he sits down and have dinner, what would be his dinner conversation. In here, pointing out that is atmospheric is that it's unnoticeable. That is the completely lack of notice on their part, these reporters and so on, that are being sensitive in this moment that they cannot help but express that deeply held racist, white supremacist view, and it passes as a way to report on a major crisis that we have in Russia's invasion of the Ukraine.
Why is this denial really? Like, I mean, even we take it, if we look at Europe's history, I mean, you know, when wars, basically World War I, World War II, you know, alone resulting in close to 100 million deaths in Europe. This is part of the history, you know, and were basically the reason why the European Union was created. And even NATO, but yet there is that denial of the, you know, we're the civilized, we shouldn't have wars here, and death and destruction just happens in the Middle East and Africa and elsewhere. Why is there that just kind of denial?
Well, I think there are a number of ways, a number of things that we need to think. One, in general, they don't educate or they don't teach history as history in the sense of European history or US history or the history of the West vis-a-vis the world. So there isn't an actual focus or a complete examination of history. Even here, if you think about this, us in the United States, we don't teach the genocide of the indigenous people. Just recently, there's beginning to be some discussion. We definitely are trying to avoid teaching and confronting the long history of enslavement and the trauma that has been visited upon the Black community and continues to be so. There is a complete erasure, denial of that. More importantly is this notion of exceptionalizing history, exceptionalizing European history and American history, which makes us that even if there is these moments of what you call utter, complete destruction, that these are incidental. They're done in good, what you call in good spirit, in essence, to build civilization. So there is this modernity, civilizational discourse that is compared or being positioned against the realm of the barbarian, the realm of the subhuman, the areas that are inhabited by the savage. So in this sense, there is that distinction, exceptionalism, erasure that takes place. Lastly, or at least thirdly, we could speak about that the violence that is manifested is almost bureaucratized. It's a bureaucratic structure of violence that on the individual levels and societal level, it's almost that you are completely clinically removed from it. So it's almost out of mind, out of sight, and it's also on an industrial scale as a structure of violence that sometimes we don't examine it or come into direct confrontation with it. And let me add also that the discussions about Ukraine and Russia is saying that this does not happen in Europe. And this is also that in 1992-95, we have another genocide that took place in Europe, the Bosnian Genocide, 300,000 that were slaughtered, with the United Nations from Western powers being actually deployed in there, especially the massacre in Srebrenica. Close to 8,000 that were completely slaughtered, with the UN actually either looking the other way or providing what you call an international cover, with 60,000 women also being raped, and rape being used as an instrument of war. And that's in the heart of Europe. You know, the notion of never again. The question is, what is the never again that Europe continues to actually time and time again repeat it? If anything, that violence in the European context is so normal that the absence of violence is the exception rather than the other way around. And I'm not yet dealing with the long history of colonial violence, the genocides that have been committed during the colonial period, whether it is in the Congo with King Leopold, or the British in terms of their complete genocide that's committed both against the indigenous populations in the Western Hemisphere, but also the death and destructions in their colonial period in India. And then they're pushing drugs on China. They arrived on China's coast, not as liberator, but as really opium dealers in this sense. So if you look at the long history of colonization, even outside of Europe, is one of the most bloody episodes in human history.
How much does the role of Islamophobia play in it? I mean, you're a world leader on the Islamophobia studies. You've been in France, you've been in Europe, you've seen what's going on now during the elections in France, in other European capitals. And then this comes that somehow I see a distinction between just plain old racism and colonialism, and then there is something specific that is specifically Islamophobic.
In here, it definitely we're seeing a very clear Islamophobic imaginary today across Europe. Having said that European discourse have always used anti-Muslim Islamophobia historically, anti-Jewish in terms of anti-Semitism, and anti-Blackness as a discourse. And then in between, all other areas of colonizations were also in there. The colonization project was always previewed or structured around a number of concepts. One is the civilization concept, the white man's burden. So the white man burden, it is a burden only once we accept that the white man is the civilized and therefore everybody else is not civilized. So that is one important aspect of colonization, colonial discourse. The second is the constant presence and constructing of fear of the Muslim subject. You could go back to the Crusades, right? The Crusades, again, speech of Pope Urban II. He specifically said this about the Muslims: these are a cursed race, while saying that Europe is a small place that does not have its resources, so we need to actually go out on a crusade in order to bring resources to Europe. So it was both Islamophobic, but also economic projects in there. So the Muslim within European imaginary and thought have always occupied this threat presenting itself as a contending in the region, whether it's in the Ottoman or even pre-Ottoman period. And then you get the expulsion in Europe in 1492, expulsion of Muslims and Jews in there. So Islamophobia can be seen as one of that threat that is very strongly rooted in modern European thought. And as we get into the 20th century, even the term Islamophobia itself emerges in the French, from the French language, Islamophobie. And then in 1910, speaking about being an inimical feeling toward Muslims, as the French were colonizing and occupying Muslim territories in North Africa, in Senegal, in West Africa. And what they wanted is to completely remove and extricate Islam out of the society and culture. So it was packaged as a civilizational discourse with a deeply rooted anti-Muslim sentiment. And we speak about the French in Algeria from the 1830s all the way up to 1961. The French killed about 6.5 million to 7 million Algerians. The last few years of the liberation struggle is about 1.5 million Algerians that perished. And the sickness included really taking and severing the heads of resistance movement fighters during the late 1800s and take them and put it in exhibits and in museums all in different parts of France. Just recently, they repatriated 23 skulls of these liberation fighters that the French have taken their skulls. So that today the discourse in Europe in terms of what is taking place in Russia and Ukraine is regenerating and having a moment of actually defining what us and using what Islamophobic, white supremacist notions in order to advance it.
I mean, it is now part of their political debate. I mean, in elections, especially in France with the candidates, with a large Muslim population. I was reading the other day, many Muslims, intellectuals are leaving the country. I mean, they're leaving. This is how much pressure they have been facing. Lastly, I want to talk a little bit more about the media, which I call it almost the walk of shame. There is no apology. There is no acknowledgement. There is on social media and on what I call alternative media, people are showing examples. I mean, it's all over. You cannot, you could be even blind and hear what's happening. And yet we haven't seen any type of apology or acknowledgement, and they're just continuing reporting the same way. Why do you think that we have this deafening silence?
Again, the media is reflect the dominant elite outlook and the dominant epistemological structure of the society. Our society in the West, the atmosphere that they breathe is reeking with white supremacy and racism. So why would you apologize in terms of the media if you are actually producing the oxygen that everybody breathes, in a sense, which is the racist oxygen? I know that we critique Trump. His crime is that he is crude in his racism.
And transparent,
crude and transparent in the sense that he is not sophisticated to actually use that same type of racist topography to articulate the same notions that many of the media who are seen to be sophisticated, the latte sophistication, the sophistication of sipping, a late afternoon drink and thinking that you are actually representing a higher form of scholarship and intellectual. These are embedded journalists that are reflective of the wide atmospheric scope of racism, white supremacy, Islamophobic discourses that we're seeing, and therefore you're not going to get an apology. Why apologize if this is actually, if you are a fish swimming in the water that gives you life and gives you meaning? So many of these that are producing this is the normative. This is like the standard, almost operating procedure. And those who might be what you call a little bit less crude, they still are reproducing the same thing. So you see the side of coverage in relations to the refugees, and compare that coverage with, let's say, the refugees in the Mediterranean, or the refugees that drowned on the in the English Channel, or the refugees that are in Calais in the on the border on the Eurotunnel, or how the refugees are problematized, made into thugs that are coming to take over Europe rather than human beings that are escaping. And similarly, think about all of the refugees coverage here on the Mexican-US border and how they're constantly problematized, even among the liberal part, which actually always problematize, try to find a solution. At least the right wing, you could give them credit. They're just upfront and clear about it. We just hate you, and we hate you, and we hate you some more. While at least on the liberal side, well, no, we're having a problem, so let's find out if we send them to Mexico so they will be dealt with there. So in essence, the same outcome is just the discourse is wrapped around this notions of atmospheric pressure or atmospheric notions of racism and white supremacy that we're seeing.
Dr. Hatem Bazian, thank you for sharing your expertise on Arab Talk.
Thank you. Thank you, Jamal, for having me.
I've meant to say, actually, Ukraine Fanon racism is atmospheric in Western Discourse. I said narrative, but that's the name of the article. So if people want to look it up.
Yes, and it's an excellent article, Jamal. And I know you and I are sharing similar reactions. I'm still, the catastrophe that's unfolding in Ukraine right now is really painful and difficult to watch, and the lack of the Western response. On the one hand, yes, they're marshaling all of these economic sanctions and trying to get in more military support for the Ukrainians. But the reality is that this is brutal. The Western response in some ways has been weak, but still, having watched that, the painful racist discourse where people are up in arms of this occupation of a country, but we notice painful silence with the occupation of Palestine, with Syria, what's going on in Yemen, and in other parts of the world. And this is part of what Professor Bazian is trying to get at. It's just like, well, yeah, this is really horrific, and we need to stand up against this brutal occupation. Yet at the same time, when Palestinians in Gaza were being slaughtered during the 2009, 2012, 2014, and continue to this day in terms of its brutal occupation throughout historic Palestine, the occupation in the Golan Heights in Syria, we hear a deafening silence from the West. This is going to run into some problems. And we know that the Israeli political apartheid establishment is really kind of nervous right now. We're going to get to that in a second. But China's occupation of Taiwan, all these different kinds of occupations where the United States lets some occupations slide and supports some apartheid occupation forces. But when it comes to certain groups, whether they be European or white or blonde or blue-eyed, then the world is up in arms. And I'm afraid, Jamal, that the racist coverage that we spoke about on our last show has continued unabated. There's been no checking of the racist kind of discourse about, oh, the poor Ukrainians, look at how much they're suffering. They're just like us. Yes, but guess what? People are suffering who don't look like you, who don't look like the correspondents on CNN.
Not only this, Jess, I mean, we talked about of course, the Western media coverage, which is dismal and really shameful throughout the past 12 days. But also now we're seeing statements, and these are, horrible statements. I watched a parliamentarian in Spain talking about, how Spain is ready to receive Ukrainian refugees, unlike Muslim refugees, and they use it. So we see the Islamophobia not only in Ukraine but also in Poland, just like flat out saying, well, these are white people, these are Europeans, we'll take them in, we don't want the Muslims. And so, I mean, they're not even shy about it, they're not even ashamed about it.
They're not shy about it.
So it's just straightforward, not only racism but also Islamophobia. So back to what we're going to be talking about today, Jess. Of course, we started by saying, the Russian and Ukrainian delegations began their talks today. They've ended now. This is on Monday in Belarus, basically aimed to ending this war that brought ruin to vast areas of Ukraine's largest cities. The two other attempts, they just basically proved to be fruitless. So this is from a Kremlin spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, who revealed today's Russia's demands. And so we want to actually discuss these. So these are actually Russia's demands to end hostilities. One, Ukraine must halt its military activity. Well, of course, we know who has the upper hand. But anyway, in other words, lay down their weapons and accept the occupation. Two, and that goes back to what Putin has been saying all along.
Right.
Really. Change its constitution to include neutrality so it can't join the EU or NATO, both. He wants that. He no longer wants kind of like, let's talk about this or a separate agreement. He wants this to be in the constitution. And I think this is what happened between Russia and Finland.
That's right.
So it is in the constitution that they're not going to be part of the EU. They're not going to be part of NATO.
That's right.
Then the third demand is to recognize Crimea as Russian territory, which, I mean, anyway, he's
well, those are all those are all non-starters, Jamal. They're all non-starters.
And then the last demand is recognize independence for the two separate regions of Donetsk and Lugansk. So that's the fourth. So 4 demands. I mean, halt military activity, change the constitution, recognize Crimea as part of Russia, and then recognize the independence of the two separatist regions.
Well, not only are those non-starters, Jamal, but it sounds much like the Israeli military demands put on Palestinians who are trying to defend themselves from a state-sponsored onslaught in Gaza, where they asked that lay down your weapons in order for there to be a ceasefire, when the Israelis had no intention of stopping their armed conflict, accept occupation, recognize, historic Palestine as no longer existing. I mean, I believe that Putin is taking this right out of the apartheid playbook of the Israelis in terms of how he's playing this and how he's kind of talking about, his narrative about Ukraine and its people and the culture and everything. I think this is right out of their playbook, Jamal. And frankly, it's a non-starter because I know I've said this a number of times, but this is the classic Putin move. He's going to make non-negotiable, non-starting demands. They will not be met, and that's going to be followed by this brutal assault on the totality of Ukraine. He's going to take it over.
Well, I should add that Putin issued a statement also saying that he does not have any plans to end Ukraine as an independent state. Unlike Israel annexing a whole, but he's saying that's not what we're looking at. I'm not looking at basically claiming Ukraine as part of Russia.
Sure, but he wants a vassal state. I mean, that's what he wants.
However, I'm going to play devil's advocate here because there is a difference. The difference is that going back to the 1990s, basically there was, I wouldn't say a written agreement, even though actually the Russians have showed minutes of the discussions that they've had about the status of the states who broke away from the Soviet Union and NATO and you know and so forth, and since 1990 14 out of those states have joined NATO, and that wasn't part of the agreement. There were minutes about it saying, you know, it's fine with the unification of East and West Berlin and Germany, East Berlin and East Germany, West Berlin and Germany, but not those republics that used to be part of the USSR.
No, I think that's a valid point.
And since then, 14, and now they are right at his border with Ukraine, and he just like said, he's saying enough is enough. Now, as far as territorial gains like Crimea, yeah, we know like he basically took over Crimea because there is a Russian majority there, and then supposedly these two independent, what he wants to have independent states, also have more Russian population and allegiance.
It's a little, I'm not sure that's entirely accurate, Jamal. What they have is more Russian speaking or more bilingual Russian communities. They are Ukrainian. What Russia has done in those breakaway regions is the way the Russians talk about it, the way Putin talks about it, is he's given hundreds of thousands of Russian passports to a lot of these individuals and is kind of counting that in his calculation. The point being is that, yes, your point is very good. It's a good devil's advocate point. I think we need to understand Putin's perspective on this, because his view on it is that he views NATO as a threat. He views Ukraine as a threat if it joins
existential threat,
as an, even though Russia has a nuclear power, and has far superior military. What I'm trying to articulate is that the West has completely miscalculated Putin yet again. They have not just miscalculated, they've underestimated Putin's viciousness. And lastly, I think we need to talk about this, because I believe that the United States and Europe and NATO have thrown Ukraine and Zelensky under the bus and have used.
That's actually was our second point, and the question is because did also Zelensky underestimate what Putin was going to do, and did he overestimate the help he was going to receive from the United States and NATO?
Absolutely. Zelensky has been thrown under the bus, Jamal, because he's been saying, "What's the big deal? We've been at the hands of the Putin and the Russians for 8 years now. What's the big worry?" He completely blew that in terms of his calculation. But if you listen to Zelensky's, daily press conferences, Jamal, he's hammering the West, as he should, for their lack of will, their lack of support, their lack of urgency in the matter. And I have sad news for President Zelensky. The West cannot do anything right now. EU or NATO can send Stinger missiles. They can try to get some MiG fighters in there. But I'm very sorry to say this to Zelensky and to the people of Ukraine, but nothing is going to stop Vladimir Putin. And you got to look to history. Putin doesn't bluff. When he says he's going to do something, he does it. He didn't bluff in Chechnya. Chechnya was there was a murderous campaign in Chechnya, and the West did nothing about that. So I'm afraid that despite the heroic depictions in the media of Ukrainian armed militia and their military standing up against Russia, if you had to put 0 to 10 on the power that the Russian military has unleashed so far, it's about 1 to 2 out of 10. This is just barely starting, Jamal. This is just barely starting.
Well, you're spot on. I've been listening to military experts. Some of them are actually military experts from the United States, general, not the ones that CNN kind of like what they want the same narrative, but others who actually are speaking from a military kind of perspective. They're not taking sides. They're not, with Putin. They're not against Putin, whatever. They're looking at it and they're saying, look, all this talk about the Russians are being stopped and whatever. It's a joke. This military expert, he's a retired general. He was saying, "Listen, I think Putin is not using all his force. He's being very careful because he has learned from our experience in Iraq." That's what he said. He knows that if he destroys the country, destroys the infrastructure, he has to own it. Who's going to repair that? And if they're going to be there for the long run, he doesn't want to go and do to Ukraine the same thing that the United States and its allies have done to Iraq. And up till now, they're still rebuilding Iraq and spending billions and billions of dollars there. But if he sees, which he's been seeing, because the one thing he acknowledges is that also Putin underestimated the reaction of the United States and Europe as far as the sanctions that they are and he says if they keep pushing these sanctions further, like for example, you start targeting the oil industry in Russia, which is the big thing, because like there one thing he said, even Visa and MasterCard and American Express, they've stopped, that's a major inconvenience because now Russian banks are starting to look into issuing cards that operate on a Chinese payment system because the Chinese, so they're going to use that after, American Express, Visa and MasterCard cut off services there. So he can circumvent that, but he cannot circumvent the sale of oil global. If they're going to push this hard towards that, he's going to accelerate his bombing and like what happened in Chechnya and start destroying cities to the ground. I mean, you've seen he has upped the ante in the past 3 days, I would say.
Right. Yeah, you're exactly right, Jamal. And here's the thing. If it's a race between cutting off Russian oil and the Russian military and Putin kind of destroying Ukraine, I'm afraid to say this, and I'm sorry to say this, but Russia can unleash its firepower and military supremacy and superiority over the innocent civilian population and infrastructure of Ukraine far faster than the world can block Russian oil. You still have Shell Oil Company buying Russian oil at discount prices. You still have China and India, China supporting not so quietly everything that the Russians are doing, even though it's going to come back to haunt them on Taiwan. You have India not saying anything. So, and we haven't even talked about Iran yet and the whole apartheid involvement of the Israeli government in playing a duplicitous game. The world will not get its act together to shut down Russia in enough time is what my worry is. And that the loss of civilian life will be grotesque. And I really see this kind of balancing act. It's not looking good for Ukraine, Jamal. It just isn't.
No, I mean, I think it's a tip of the iceberg. Things are going to get much worse before they get better. And I have to say, some of those military experts and others, they have been saying, listen, you want to end this? Zelensky has to accept those demands. If he wants to save his own people, if he wants to save the country and himself, and if he doesn't want to just like keep listening to taking his marching orders from the United States or from Europe or from this or from that, because they kind of like, pumped his ego so much that maybe he has to come down a little bit to earth and I don't know. I mean, this is not our perspective, but this is what the experts. And the one thing I have to say, and this will take us to our next topic is that I actually been talking to someone in Ukraine. I cannot bring them on the show because of their safety and security. And some of the points that our contact there has been making is that, and he believes that Zelensky was basically duped by the United States and NATO. But also
that.
he adds to it, and he thinks that one of the plans why the Biden administration and European countries, etc., want to go through this, besides the whole military industrial complex, is also to benefit from these sanctions by taking the money out of the oligarch hands and whatever. He has like this whole conspiracy theory about the US and Europe benefiting financially from freezing the assets, billions and billions of dollars of Russians. And which makes sense, because the United States froze the assets of Libyan assets, Iraqi assets, and every conflict.
Iranian assets, Afghan assets.
So he's saying there are billions and billions of unaccounted billions of dollars that are in the West, in American banks and in European banks, and so there are people who will benefit because of this, which leads us to talking about those oligarchs.
Well, Jamal, I just think it's kind of interesting. Apparently, to AIPAC and to pro-Israel supporters, there's good oligarchs and there's bad oligarchs. Universally, the oligarchs are seeing as Putin, supporters, sycophants. Everybody sees that. But apparently, some of these oligarchs have been funding right-wing extremists, settler colonial movements in occupied Palestine. They've been doing a lot of dirty work. Abramovich is one of them. We'll get to him in a second. But it appears that AIPAC and some of the pro-Israel supporters are willing to not come down hard on the oligarchs that are supporting the apartheid state. That the stench of hypocrisy, again, coming from Naftali Bennett and the apartheid crew in Israel, seems to be, that stench is coming all the way to DC right now.
Well, let me start by quoting President Biden in his State of the Union address last Tuesday, just and he addressed that point, calling out the Russian oligarchs directly. So we want to hold him to his words. He said, "Tonight I say to the Russian oligarchs and corrupt leaders who built billions of dollars of this violent regime, no more." And there was bipartisan applause when he said that. The United States Department of Justice is assembling a dedicated task force to go after the crimes of the Russian oligarchs. We are joining with European allies to find and seize their yachts, their luxury apartments, their private jets. We are coming for you. Yet, and that's what I mean, according to, and this is, I think I want to direct people to this very good article in the Jewish Currents publication. It's called Our Oligarch. The Israel lobby, or lobby groups, both in the United States and Canada and Europe, I have to say, they've started their campaign to exempt some of those oligarchs that you're talking about from these sanctions, most notably Roman Abramovich. So, who Forbes in 2005 described him as the wealthiest man in Russia, and who is also the second wealthiest person in Israel after the widow of Sheldon Adelson. You remember Sheldon Adelson?
Of course.
Since he acquired Israeli citizenship in 2018. The question to you, Jess, is why?
Well, we know why, because Abramovich has been funding and sending millions and millions of dollars, funneling and through shell organizations and hiding money, a lot of his wealth through various Israeli organizations, including extremist violent settler movements who have been stealing Palestinian land and, killing Palestinians. He's also funded a lot of I think the Holocaust Museum too in Israel. So the guy has had deep pockets. He's been celebrated throughout the apartheid regime. He's an apartheid lover, and it appears that there is a price tag when it comes to democracy. Some oligarchs are good oligarchs and some are bad. And despite what Joe Biden has said, Jamal, it seems like the Israelis want to protect the ones that are funneling a lot of their ill-begotten blood money to the apartheid regime. So this story is not going to go away. Abramovich is in deep.
Well, I don't know if he's in deep trouble. I mean, he has definitely a lot of money and property in the United States. So there is an easy answer to seizing his assets because they're right there in New York and elsewhere in the U.S.
We'll see. But
they're all over Europe. But the reason he's getting all this support, he donated millions to ADL. Right, so ADL received millions from him, and yes, he donated. That's to me not the important issue, like donating to museums and Holocaust memorials or whatever. But the important thing, just which you alluded to, start talking about this, that he used front companies registered in the British Virgin Islands to donate more than $100 million to right-wing settler groups.
That's right.
And a settler and an Israeli right-wing organization called the Ir David Foundation, which we actually talked about the Ir David Foundation, in commonly known as Elad, which has worked since 1990 to move Jewish settlers into occupied East Jerusalem, to displace Palestinians in Jerusalem and move these settlers in. And they also control archaeological parks and major tourist sites and the City of David project. And with all the intention is to basically ethnically cleanse Jerusalem from its Palestinian residents and Judaize the whole area, including Silwan, where they're digging under even people's homes.
Well, and Sheikh Jarrah, Jamal,
to drive them away. So he basically, I mean, this settler group, which is a very racist, akin to the KKK, basically, just in this country, they received half their budget from him, half their budget.
So my question to you, Jamal, why hasn't CNN reported on this?
Why they want.
Why hasn't the New York Times reported on this?
It's the same way CNN that they reported today. I'm taking you offline here a little bit, that Gigi Hadid, Palestinian American top model, made a pledge to support Ukrainian refugees, basically donate out of her fall show in 2022 to Ukrainian refugees and Palestinian refugees because they suffer from the same issue, which is occupation. CNN in its headline said, Gigi Hadid pledged to donate to Ukrainian refugees. They eliminated Palestinians.
That's my point, Jamal. That's exactly my point. That's the totality of our show again today, is the asymmetry, the hypocrisy, and the racism on the reporting between Ukrainian refugees, Ukrainian occupation, and the Palestinian refugees, Syrian occupation, and Palestinian occupation, the asymmetry and the hypocrisy. And the fact that Abramovich can get all this support from pro-Israel groups in Canada and the United States, the proof will be in the pudding about what Joe Biden said. I have no confidence that Joe Biden's words will
He's going to get a pass. Just like Israel gets a pass, he will get a pass.
100% he'll get a pass. And here's another part of the story, which I want our listeners and viewers to understand. The United States wants a deal with Iran for the nuclear deal with Iran. The Russians are threatening to scuttle that relationship. The Israelis want to scuttle it too. So if you want to talk about really kind of degenerate bedfellows between Putin and Naftali Bennett, they have strategic interests in supporting the Russian occupation because Vladimir Putin has threatened to derail the Iran nuclear talks. So you have all these crazy strategic interests. The net is, when I read the the story that was breaking news yesterday that Naftali Bennett is brokering a deal between Putin and Zelensky, not only did it make me sick, I knew that, the backstory would never come out on that. Of course, the backstory would never come out.
Well, they're trying now to paint Bennett. He's like this peace-loving man who's traveling across the globe to broker a peace.
He has his strategic interests, and his strategic interest is to scuttle the Iran nuclear deal and to stay close to Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin and Naftali Bennett according to Bennett, need to have a strategic relationship, and he's willing to throw Joe Biden. He's willing to throw Zelensky. He's willing to throw the United States under the bus for his own strategic interests. And this story will not be told anywhere, Jamal, except, here on Arab Talk and maybe some other places. But this is really, really an ugly underbelly of how these things happen. And I think Abramovich is going to get a pass. I think he'll get a pass. He's an Israeli citizen.
He is. Well, we have few minutes, Jess, but there's hardly any news reports about COVID or Omicron.
And
as
it's
if the
bad,
invasion
Jamal.
of Ukraine has eradicated the pandemic. What are the repercussions? I mean...
Well, let me give our listeners and viewers some breaking news. Omicron has not gone away. COVID-19 has not gone away. Just in the last 24 hours.
Except in the media, it has gone away.
Except in the media. Because in the last 24 hours, China has reported an explosive expansion of Omicron infections, even though China has a no COVID, exception. Like if you get COVID, you're completely quarantined. They will shut down entire cities of hundreds of thousands of people. Despite that, China is in the grips of a really catastrophic infectious wave right now throughout China.
And Vietnam is...
But here's another thing. New Zealand was thinking that it had, completely bypassed the whole COVID epidemic. And it too is experiencing a massive explosion of Omicron infection. So Jamal, I'm going to say something that isn't popular. I'm one of those people who believe that the relaxing of the mask mandates was a mistake. And
no, that's not popular, Jess. It's not.
I know it's not popular.
You're not going to be popular.
I'm going to get a lot of hate mail. We're going to get a lot of hate mail, but I think it's premature. It was done politically, obviously, just like it was done politically in the opposite direction before. Now that it's being relaxed a little bit, I think it's a huge problem, especially when you have the majority of children under the age of 12 right now still not fully vaccinated, and no one under the age of 5 vaccinated yet. I think you're putting children at risk, you're putting people at risk, and this is not going away. It's, as you said rightly, it's gone away in the media. But if you look at what's happening in terms of infection rates, we're now seeing these infections exploding in Asia, in New Zealand. And just to make matters, worse, Jamal, I'm sorry to say this, but now there's bird flu being found in the East Coast of the United States. And if bird flu starts to accelerate in terms of its infectious processes through the United States, we're in deep trouble. So unfortunately, the media is, opportunistic, Jamal. They're going to celebrate Ukrainian resistance, even though you and I are both really concerned about the slaughter that's going to happen, unfortunately, or could very well happen soon. So the media needs to do its job. I don't expect that it will, but, we're in trouble with Omicron and we're in trouble with Ukraine.
You've been listening to Arab Talk on KPOO San Francisco, 89.5 FM. Go to our website, arabtalkradio.com. And to download all our shows are right there, and we will talk to you next week.
We'll see you next week.